let me say something that might make you shift in your seat a little. There's a strange kind of silence that happens when both of you stop reaching out. Not the dramatic kind, not the angry kind, the quiet kind, the kind where you wake up, check your phone out of habit, and realize you're not actually waiting for a message anymore. You tell yourself you're fine. You tell yourself this is what you wanted. But deep down, there's a tension sitting in your chest that hasn't gone anywhere. Because when you go no contact, people expect you to struggle. But when the avoidant goes no contact too, no one really talks about what happens next. This is the part most men misunderstand. You assume silence means relief for them. You imagine they moved on faster. You picture them feeling lighter, without emotional pressure. And on the surface, that story makes sense. Avoidants are known for distancing. They're known for shutting down. They're known for disappearing when things get too close. But here's the uncomfortable truth. When both of you stop contacting each other, something very different starts happening internally. For both sides, what feels like peace at first slowly turns into something else. What looks like detachment begins to reveal cracks. And what you're experiencing isn't weakness. It's a psychological shift. This video isn't about getting them back. It's not about manipulation, waiting games, or silent power moves. It's about understanding what silence actually does when there's an emotional bond that never got real closure. When no contact is mutual, the dynamic changes. The roles change. The story in their head starts rewriting itself. And so does yours. And if you don't understand this phase, you'll either misread their behavior or betray yourself trying to fix something that no longer needs fixing. Today, we're going to walk through what actually happens when avoidant and you both stop reaching out. Not in theory, not in labels, but in real, human emotional terms, the kind most men were never taught to recognize. By the end of this video, you'll understand why the silence feels heavier than expected, why it affects them differently than you think, and why this phase is far more important than the breakup itself. At first, the silence feels manageable. There's no tension, no mixed signals, no emotional tug of war, just space. And you tell yourself this is finally peace. But that calm doesn't last. In the early days of mutual, no contact, your nervous system starts to settle. You're not reacting anymore. You're not waiting for crumbs of attention or decoding short replies. There's relief in that. For the first time in a while, your emotional energy isn't being pulled outward. This is where most men think the story ends. They assume the same relief is happening on the avoidant side, and that's where the misunderstanding begins. For an avoidant, the initial silence feels familiar. Distance has always been their coping mechanism. So when communication stops on both ends, it appears like nothing changed for them. No confrontation, no pressure, no expectations. On the surface, it looks like freedom, but underneath that calm is something fragile. Because this silence isn't caused by them pulling away this time. It's mutual, and that changes the internal meaning completely. Avoidants regulate their emotions by controlling closeness. When they step back, they feel safe because they chose a distance. But when you stop reaching out too, the distance no longer feels controlled. It feels uncertain. At first, they rationalize it. They tell themselves you're busy, that this is temporary, that you'll reach out eventually. Meanwhile, on your side, something quieter is happening. Without constant contact, your mind stops spinning around them. The emotional charge begins to fade. You start having longer stretches where they're not the first thing you think about in the morning or the last thing at night. And that shift, subtle as it is, matters more than you realize. This is the moment where the silence stops being neutral. For the avoidant, the lack of movement from you introduces a new question they don't like sitting with. What if this time I didn't just create space? What if I actually lost it? They don't panic yet. Avoidants rarely do, at least not visibly. Instead, there's a low-level restlessness, a quiet checking of their phone, a brief thought of reaching out that gets shut down just as quickly. For you, the calm starts turning into clarity. You begin noticing how much emotional effort you were carrying, how often you were the one bridging the gap. And with that awareness comes a new discomfort, not longing, but realization. This stage isn't dramatic. There are no messages sent, No confessions made. But internally, the balance has shifted. And once that balance changes, the silence stops being peaceful and starts becoming revealing. There's a moment when silence stops feeling like a choice and starts feeling like a loss of control. That moment doesn't arrive loudly. It arrives as a quiet irritation they can't fully explain. For the avoidant, distance only feels safe when it's self-directed. When they're the one deciding when to engage and when to pull back, their nervous system stays regulated. But mutual no contact removes that advantage. You're no longer orbiting them. You're no longer predictable. And unpredictability is deeply unsettling for an avoidant. At this stage, they begin mentally checking for signs. Not because they miss you in a romantic, dramatic way, but because they need confirmation that the door is still open, that they still matter in your world. What unsettles them isn't your absence. It's your lack of reaction. They expect some signal, a check-in, a question, a soft reach out, something that reassures them they still have emotional access. When it doesn't come, a subtle internal pressure builds. This is where control quietly slips. They might replay old interactions, not with nostalgia, but with evaluation. Was I colder than I thought? Did I pull away too hard? These thoughts aren't emotional yet, they're strategic. The avoidant mind tries to problem solve before it allows itself to feel. Meanwhile, you're doing something that feels almost wrong at first. You're not chasing clarity. You're letting the silence exist without trying to fix it. And that sends a powerful signal without you saying a word. Your nervous system starts recalibrating. You're no longer driven by the need to restore connection at all costs. You're tolerating uncertainty, and that's a skill most avoidants secretly lack. As days pass, the avoidant's internal narrative starts shifting. The silence begins to feel less like space and more like rejection. Not overt rejection, but something worse for them, emotional irrelevance. They won't admit this to themselves directly. Instead, it shows up as defensiveness, justifications, a quiet story that you must be the one disengaging, so they don't have to confront what it means. But here's the truth most men never hear. Avoidants don't chase when they feel wanted. They chase when they feel replaced internally, when the emotional tether loosens. And that tether loosens when you stop managing the connection for both of you. At this stage, they still won't reach out. Pride, fear, and emotional suppression keep them still, but the dynamic has changed. The power isn't shifting because you're playing a game. It's shifting because you're no longer holding the rope alone. And once control slips, the avoidant's inner world starts doing something unfamiliar. It starts reacting instead of avoiding. That's when the silence begins to work on them, even though it looks like nothing is happening at all. At first, the silence feels clean. Then it starts to echo. This is a stage where nothing externally happens. But internally, everything gets louder. There's no conversation, no conflict, no message to analyze, just space. And for the avoidant, that space doesn't stay neutral for long. What begins to surface isn't longing in a romantic sense. It's a low-level agitation, a restlessness they can't place, the sense that something unresolved is sitting in the background, quietly demanding attention. They notice it most in still moments. At night, during downtime, when there's nothing left to distract them, their mind circles the same questions without landing anywhere. Why does this feel different? Why am I thinking about this now? There's no clear emotional label, just pressure. And because avoidants are skilled at pushing feelings away, this pressure doesn't release. It lingers. They don't miss you in a sentimental way yet. They miss the role you played in regulating their inner world. Your presence, even inconsistent, gave them a reference point, someone who responded, someone who stayed available, someone who anchored the dynamic. Without that, their internal equilibrium is off, and that's deeply uncomfortable. They begin to sense a loss that doesn't fit their usual story. This wasn't supposed to hurt. Silence was supposed to be easier. Distance was supposed to bring relief. Instead, it brings friction, like a door that won't fully close. They may try to reason it away. This is normal. I just need time. I'm better off this way. But these thoughts don't settle anything. They just cover the noise temporarily. Underneath, something unfamiliar is happening. They're starting to feel the consequences of emotional avoidance. Not as pain yet, but as mental clutter, thoughts they didn't invite, emotional static they can't mute. Meanwhile, you're adapting in a way they didn't expect. You're not spiraling outward. You're turning inward. Your nervous system is learning to self-regulate without them. And that shift matters more than you realize. Because the bond between you wasn't just emotional, it was energetic. It existed in patterns, expectations, and emotional roles. When you step out of your role, the system destabilizes. For the avoidant, this is unsettling because it removes the illusion that they can disengage without impact. The silence becomes a mirror they didn't ask for. And in that mirror, they don't see you chasing. They see absence, not dramatic absence. Final absence. This is where the internal noise stops being ignorable. Not because they suddenly want connection, but because they can no longer avoid the feeling of having avoided something important. They won't reach out yet. They won't admit anything yet. But internally, the silence has stopped being empty. It started to speak. Here's the uncomfortable part most men don't want to hear. Silence doesn't mean you're in control. And waiting doesn't automatically make you strong. This stage exposes a mistake many men make when no contact happens on both sides. They start treating silence like a strategy instead of a reality. Counting days, watching signs, hoping the other person breaks first. That mindset quietly pulls your power away. When you frame no contact as a test, you're still emotionally engaged. You're still reacting. You're still placing your worth on what someone else eventually does. And the avoidant feels this energy, even without contact, not consciously, but relationally. Avoidants are highly sensitive to pressure, even indirect pressure. So when a man stays silent while internally waiting, hoping, rehearsing outcomes, the dynamic hasn't actually changed. You're still positioned as available, just quiet. And here's the wake-up truth. An avoidant doesn't step forward because you waited longer. They step forward when the emotional contract breaks. That only happens when you stop orienting your inner world around them altogether. This is where self-respect gets tested, not through big declarations, not through ultimatums, but through what you do with your attention. If your focus is still on whether they'll miss you, message you, regret you, then you're reinforcing the same imbalance that made the relationship unstable in the first place. So here's the one clear wake-up advice. Stop using silence to get something, and start using it to become someone who no longer needs the outcome. That shift is subtle, but it's seismic. When you genuinely redirect your energy into structure, purpose, physical grounding, and emotional self-leadership, the avoidant senses the absence differently, not as abandonment, but as finality. And finality is what forces clarity. This isn't about punishment. It's about alignment. Either they step into the emotional space you vacated, or they step out of your life entirely. Both outcomes require the same thing from you: integrity. The men who break this cycle aren't the ones who wait the longest. They're the ones who stop waiting at all. And once that happens, the silence stops being a weapon and starts becoming a filter. What comes next depends on whether you truly let go or just went quiet. There's a quiet moment that doesn't get talked about enough. It's the moment when silence stops feeling temporary and starts feeling real. At first, no contact feels like space. Then it feels like distance. And eventually, it turns into something else entirely. Separation. Not dramatic, not announced, just internal. This is where the dynamic changes permanently. When both of you stop reaching out, the avoidant initially experiences relief. The pressure is gone. The expectations are gone. The emotional demand feels reduced. And for a while, that feels like peace, but that peace is shallow. Because once the nervous system settles, something else shows up: the absence of impact, the absence of your presence as a stabilizing force, the absence of being seen without having to perform. This is when the avoidant begins to mentally rewrite the connection, not to erase it, but to make sense of why it no longer exists. And here's the critical part most people miss. If you've truly detached, not just gone silent, but emotionally reorganized your life, the avoidant feels that absence as final, Not hostile, not dramatic, just done. That finality does one of two things. It either creates a slow, internal reckoning, a realization that the connection ended not because of conflict, but because it couldn't survive emotional distance, or it creates a quiet exit, where they accept the loss without closure, because return would require emotional availability they're not yet capable of offering. Both outcomes are revealing, but neither of them are about winning. By this stage, the story is no longer about whether they come back. It's about whether you recognize that silence has already given you the answer. No contact doesn't work when it's used to provoke. It works when it reflects truth. And the truth at this stage is simple. Relationships don't end when communication stops. They end when emotional responsibility is no longer shared. If they step forward here, it's because they're ready to meet you where you stand. If they don't, it's because the silence revealed a limit neither of you could move past. Either way, the silence has done its job, not by bringing them back, but by showing you what was never fully there to begin with. And once you see that clearly, the silence no longer hurts. It clarifies. Here's the controversial truth most people avoid saying out loud. When both of you go no contact, the outcome doesn't depend on who breaks first. It depends on who actually lets go. Silence isn't a strategy. It's a mirror. If an avoidant comes back, it's not because you waited perfectly or played the situation well. It's because the space exposed something they could no longer ignore. And if they don't come back, it's not a failure on your part. It's clarity arriving without negotiation. What matters is what you become in the absence. If you use the silence to grow steadier, more self-led, more emotionally grounded, then the outcome already worked in your favor. Regardless of whether they return, you didn't lose them. You outgrew the dynamic. And if this story feels uncomfortably familiar, you're not alone. Many men sit quietly in this space, questioning whether they mattered, whether it was real, whether they should have done more. So I want to hear from you. Did silence bring them back, or did it finally bring you back to yourself? Share your experience in the comments. Not for advice, not for validation, just honesty. Because the strongest connections don't survive silence by accident. They survive when two people are willing to meet it with emotional responsibility. And if only one person was doing that, the silence was never the problem.